Hey, let's do it for the content. Mega Ran. Let's go. Let's get it. Dick Kick City. It gets gritty when Mega Ran come through. The kid gets busy. Work yourself into a shoot, but you know it's legit. Like what you like, just don't be a dick. Hey, wrestling with regret. Let's get it. Yeah. What's that scent? Maybe you should bottle it. Drink it and spray it on. Get Claude to model it. 8 years in, can't look back. Who else can make the Lord sweatsuits look whack? Wrestling with regret. Let's get it. Yeah.
There's often much to be made about those so-called preordained champions through wrestling history. Guys like Hulk Hogan, The Rock, Randy Orton, Roman Reigns, and Drew McIntyre, well, his arc had a much longer payoff than everyone else I mentioned, who were selected and groomed for the deliberate purpose of becoming a world champion. Though they still had to put the work in like everyone else, theirs was in many ways a smoother journey. But screw those guys. This week I'm talking about the underdogs, the ones who bucked the trends, defied the odds, and inspired the masses on their way to championship glory. This week I'm gonna rank them the top 8 unlikeliest world champions of all time. P.S. No Arquette or Russo on this countdown because it's been done to death. Thanks. Number 8, Bret Hart. Bret Hart has something in common with a lot of folks on this list, and that his legend today is ironclad. Newer fans never lived in a time when Bret wasn't considered an all-time great, but until it actually happened, few predicted that it would. After a brief flirtation with a solo run before being pulled back into Jim Neidhart's orbit with the Hart Foundation, the Hitman finally got his big singles push after WrestleMania 7. He was almost immediately positioned as the biggest threat to Mr. Perfect's Intercontinental Championship, which he won in classic fashion at SummerSlam 91. Over the next year, Bret and his rivals helped build the title's legacy as the Workhorse belt before he lost it to Davey Boy Smith at the following SummerSlam at Wembley Stadium. By the fall of 92, the federal government was breathing down Vince McMahon's neck, leading to a sweeping steroid policy, and in a move that may or may not have been connected, the firings of the Ultimate Warrior and the British Bulldog. On top of that, Ric Flair was battling an inner ear injury that affected his balance. With their biggest names gone or hurt, McMahon and company decided that Bret would be the one to carry the torch for the Federation. Much like how Nirvana and grunge rock killed off hair metal for good, the Hitman's victory over the Nature Boy at a house show in Saskatchewan in October of that year represented a much-needed step away from the 80s. And while wrestling's biggest companies would dip back to that well time and time again, Bret Hart as the man of the mid-90s helped significantly alter the culture of the WWF and prove that the main event wasn't just reserved for the muscleheads. Number 7, Ken Shamrock. The more I look back at Ken Shamrock and the WWF, oh, there's an idea for an episode, the more I realize that his biggest opponent during that run was really just bad timing. Had he debuted a few years before or after he did, I think he easily could have been slotted into a world title position. But it's hard to get a place at a table already occupied by guys like Shawn Michaels, Steve Austin, Mankind, The Rock, and The Undertaker. When Pride came calling in 1999, Shamrock was released from his contract and returned to his first love of MMA. Wrestling-wise, nothing was heard from Ken for a good while. Then along came a little engine that could, called NWA TNA. In the spring of 2002, the Jarretts teamed up with the National Wrestling Alliance to create an alternative to the Federation Empire in the form of weekly pay-per-views. Seemingly out of nowhere, Shamrock ended a 3-year hiatus from the business by appearing on TNA's first ever show, surviving a gauntlet for the gold match and winning the vacant NWA World's Heavyweight Championship. That's a hell of a comeback. While it was certainly a welcome surprise to see Ken back, and you could argue him being a world champion was overdue, it was kind of a weird move for TNA to begin this brand new operation by strapping up a guy who'd been a ghost in wrestling for the last 3 years and wasn't exactly lighting the MMA world on fire in the meantime. It also didn't help matters that Shamrock's primary rival for this unlikely reign was Malice, aka The Wall. That's the shits, brother! Despite signing a year-long deal with the company, Shamrock was gone by August after having lost the belt to Ron the Truth Killings. And aside from a single match in 2009 against Jimmy Jacobs at Where Else? The Gathering of the Juggalos, that was it for Ken's time in wrestling for the next 14 years. Number 6, Ron Simmons. Speaking of killings, the man known today as R-Truth became the first African American to hold the 10 pounds of gold when he beat Shamrock in 2002. And as historic as that was, it was this man who first broke the glass ceiling. Ron Simmons possessed almost every quality that old-school promoters looked for: charisma, size, and a legitimate athletic pedigree to boot. He certainly didn't languish in World Championship Wrestling. He was part of the dominant tag team of Doom with Butch Reed, and he even challenged Lex Luger for the WCW title at Halloween Havoc 91. But after that match, he was soon shunted down to the lower mid-card along the likes of Big Josh and Van Hammer, a man who stayed in wrestling for as long as he sucked in wrestling. By which I mean he stayed for a long time and sucked a lot. Simmons' fortunes changed for the better when Cowboy Bill Watts became the executive vice president of WCW in 1992. Watts would eventually be fired from his position after an old interview surfaced that painted him as a racist, among other things. It's ironic considering he was somewhat of a revolutionary in Mid-South, known for having more than one black wrestler on his roster at a time, and I can't believe I have to say that that was a thing. Watts made a lot of changes while in charge of WCW, and while some edicts like no flying off the top rope and no patting on the floor pussy drew ire from fans and wrestlers alike, perhaps one of his greatest legacies as a booker was giving the strap to Ron Simmons. Filling in for an injured Stinger against the champion Vader, Simmons power slammed his way into the history books on August 2, 1992. According to Storyline, Simmons was picked because his name was drawn at random in a raffle with everyone else in the locker room. Do you think they just told Van Hammer his name was in the hat? Both Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright held claims to the World Championship back in the 60s, but never got their due. The sight of Simmons being celebrated for this massive achievement was one decades in the making. Number 5. Tommy Rich. There's an old saying that the brightest stars often burn out the quickest. Tommy Rich's star, at least in terms of being a main event player, was one such example. Rich came out of the Memphis territory and soon became one of the top baby faces in Georgia Championship Wrestling, which was broadcast nationally on WTBS, all while he was still in his early 20s. His shocking victory over Harley Race on August 1st of 1981, followed almost immediately by Race winning it back only 4 days later, ran fans along an emotional gamut from excitement to confusion. Theories have run wild in the decades since as to why this reign was so short. Did Harley get his bell rung? Was the referee paid off? Did Tommy do the deed with Georgia promoter Jim Barnett? Nope, it was none of those things. The real reason? Good old carny politics. Essentially, a power struggle had emerged between Barnett and the other owners of GCW, most notably Ole Anderson, with whom Barnett frequently butted heads. The dispute between the two would eventually lead to everyone but Ole selling their shares in Georgia to Vince McMahon, leading to what historians refer to as Black Saturday, and I am not getting into all that here. As the head of the NWA booking committee at the time, Barnett booking his own top babyface to win the belt for a blip was solely a power play, not some bold new booking direction. It strengthened Georgia's position as one of the most important promotions in the country, and it was Barnett's bold reminder to his business associates of the power that he wielded. In the end, Tommy Rich's big win wound up doing more harm than good. It's not fair to say that he had a bad career, it's just that by never coming close to that level of glory again, the reign was seen as a fluke that buried the rest of his accomplishments. Well, that and his run in the FBI. Hey, speaking of ECW, number 4, Mikey Whipwreck. Of all of wrestling's greatest underdogs, Rey Mysterio, the Mulkeys, the 1-2-3 Kid, I would argue that the quintessential underdog story belongs to Mikey Whipwreck. Mikey entered professional wrestling the old-fashioned way, setting up rings for ECW. When there was downtime before the matches, Whipwreck and other members of the crew would practice spots, which grabbed the attention of Paul Heyman. Paul E was apparently so impressed with Whipwreck's level of skill, despite having no official experience, that he invited him to join the roster as an enhancement talent. Whipwreck spent his first several months as a pro putting over monsters like Mr. Hughes, Mike Awesome, and 911, while slowly gaining respect from the ECW fanbase. It's kind of how my first year in wrestling went, except for that whole gaining the respect of the fans part. But ECW's mad scientist saw something more in Whipwreck and booked him to win the TV championship out of nowhere from Pitbull Gary Wolf in May of '94. The meek Whipwreck would try to get out of defending it, offering his opponents the title to save himself the beating, only for him to somehow still win and retain despite himself. Mikey gained more confidence over the next year, befriending Cactus Jack and winning the tag titles as a substitute for Terry Funk, as well as PWI's Rookie of the Year. By Halloween of '95, Whipwreck finally defeated the Sandman for the ECW World title after multiple failed attempts. In doing so, he became the first and the youngest Triple Crown winner in company history. The honeymoon didn't last long for Whipwreck, but he would eventually hold gold again and remained a fixture of ECW until its dying days. Not bad for a kid who showed up to help set up the ring. Number 3, Eddie Guerrero. Eddie Guerrero is someone else on this list who we all know now is a legend. Of course he was a world champion, it should be obvious, he was awesome. Well, yes, that much is true, but again, it wasn't always that way. When a young Eddie with a Y, Guerrero, first broke out as a member of Los Gringos Locos with Love Machine Art Barr, Eddie was, well, the chavo of the team. While Art was so dynamic in the ring he was once referred to as Mexico's Ric Flair, Eddie had yet to come out of his shell. Nevertheless, the two were on their way to debuting together in ECW before Art passed away in his sleep in November of 1994. Eddie began working in America solo, but it wasn't until his heel turn in WCW in 1997 when the embers of the blazing inferno known as Latino Heat would flicker. Though Eddie performed at a consistently high level, he was frustrated with a lack of upward mobility in the company, due in large part to his size. Injuries and substance abuse problems severely compromised Guerrero's path in the WWF, leading to his release in 2001. Eddie came back less than a year later after cleaning up, though this time on thin ice. And as the months went on, his performances were so good he became impossible to boo. The ratings for his segments on SmackDown began to outpace all others, especially with the newly coveted Latino demographic. Eddie's big night finally came at No Way Out 2004 at the Cow Palace in Daly City, California. In a match that would probably have been booked as a squash 10 years earlier, Eddie conquered the Beast to win the WWE Championship, becoming the first Latino star since Pedro Morales nearly 30 years prior to do so. Fairy tales do come true, at least they did on this night in the Bay. Addiction has derailed the lives and careers of so many people in professional wrestling, and unfortunately, not all of them have been able to come back. But for Eddie to get clean, come back to the company, and go on to win their main championship, to beat the odds against that happening, you'd have to, well, lie, cheat, and steal. Number 2, CM Punk. Yes, I know we just talked about him at length here a couple of weeks ago, and we're still talking about him in the present day, for that matter. You may or may not be sick of it, and I apologize. But no matter your feelings on the man, CM Punk winning his first world championship in WWE at the time felt like an impossibility given where he came from. Punk arrived in WWE in 2005 with a reputation as one of the biggest independent darlings of them all. From his look, to his promo, to his in-ring abilities, there was no way to confuse him with any of WWE's other ideal stars, so he had quite the uphill battle from the jump. There was a time when Vince making guys like Bret and Shawn his world champion was considered a huge concession, but this former ROH star who is not only small, but covered in tattoos, get out of town! For better or for worse, Punk had two major advocates while in WWE, his fans and Paul Heyman. It's been well documented how much prejudice he had to overcome from higher-ups and producers, but Punk was too popular to be pushed too far down the card. The Punker also benefited simply from the passage of time, as numerous long-term stars began to slowly leave the company. And despite winning the WWE or world title multiple times, each one felt like a victory against insurmountable political odds. I spoke 2 weeks ago about how impactful Punk was to the disillusioned fan, but it's also worth talking about the era he helped usher in for wrestlers. Without Punk, we probably don't get Daniel Bryan, Kevin Owens, or AJ Styles as world champs in WWE. Samoa Joe may likely have never been hired to begin with. Like Bret and Shawn before him, it was Punk's success in spite of everything that changed the perception of who could and couldn't be a star. Before I share my number 1 entry, here are a few honorable mentions. Tessa Blanchard. Tessa Blanchard being an unlikely world champion works in 2 ways. 1, she's a woman, and 2, she's barely around long enough to hold a job. In January of 2020, just before the pandemic turned wrestling and the rest of the world upside down, Tessa became the first female world champion for a major organization when she beat Sami Callihan for the belt at Impact's Hard to Kill. The win was historic, but it was covered by a dark cloud of controversy. Just days before the pay-per-view, Tessa was accused of making racist comments toward a black colleague during a ladies' tour in Japan. Tessa's dug in her heels and denied the accusations, but it's only one part of a broader reputation of being difficult to work with, which may at least partly explain why she remains a free agent. Hell, they brought WoW back from the dead for her, and she's already out of the company. But despite all the behind-the-scenes controversy, Tessa Blanchard's Impact World title victory remains a phenomenal achievement. Jinder Mahal. When you think about it, Jinder Mahal is kind of the antithesis of Ron Simmons in this countdown. While you could argue that Simmons and other black wrestlers of his era were held back because of their race, some would argue that Jinder Mahal's Indian heritage was the main reason he got the nod. Well, not just that. I mean, did you see his gains? Much like WWE's eternal search to find the next great Latino star in the same vein as Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio, in 2017 they felt they needed an Indian superstar to attract a potential fan base from the second most populated country in the world. What they got was Jinder Mahal, a perennial jobber and former member of 3MB who was never allowed to go anywhere beyond the stereotypical foreign heel trope after winning the title from Randy Orton at that year's Backlash. Did they just expect Indian fans to cheer him on national pride alone? Even though dude's from Canada? Jinder was hindered, and his race back to the bottom of the card was almost as swift as his way up. If you weren't following WWE back then but are watching today, you would have no idea that it even happened. Unfortunately, the experiment failed to produce the desired outcome. Turns out you can put the belt on anybody, but you can't outrun lazy booking. Ronnie Garvin. 42-year-old Ronnie Garvin was given the strap simply as part of a promotional scheme to fight the World Wrestling Federation. Jim Crockett Promotions had struggled in 1987, and with Starrcade approaching, JCP knew they needed a hook to convince fans to choose their show over the first ever Survivor Series airing on the same day. What that meant was they wanted Ric Flair to lose the belt, then regain it at the big show. But instead of risking the credibility of their real stars like Dusty Rhodes or Nikita Koloff with such a short reign, they felt that Garvin was the safe choice. Of course, it all backfired as the Federation used its leverage to stonewall JCP out of most pay-per-view markets, as fans resolutely snubbed their noses at Garvin as champ. Much like Tommy Rich, Garvin's reign was a prime example of a title doing more harm than good to a performer who didn't exactly fit the bill. Chris Sabin. In the year 2055, when Impact Wrestling is no doubt still around after all the other companies died out, history will look favorably upon the Aces and Eights storyline. Considered one of the top angles during the Hulk Hogan era, the story's emotional high point came when Bully Ray won the TNA World title and revealed himself as the leader of the group bent on taking over the company. Aces and Eights had a great first and second act, but as they stumbled through their third, along came multiple-time X Division and Tag Team Champion Chris Sabin, with a big emphasis on those particular divisions, if you get my meaning. A feud for the belt against then-champ Bobby Roode was hinted at when Sabin was written off for ACL surgery, but by the time he came back in July of 2013, the landscape had drastically changed. But that's okay, a world title for you anyway. Sabin traded in his X Division title for a shot at Bully Ray and the World Championship, and in one of the biggest shocks of the Aces and Eights era, won the strap on the July 18th episode of Impact, but in his first defense lost it back to Bully less than a month later. Sabin never came close to that level of singles glory again. And my pick for the least likely world champion of all time is Mick Foley. This'll put some butts in seats. Mick Foley took perhaps the longest, windiest road to world title glory. Entering the wrestling business as the territories were drying up for good, Mick literally took giant leaps of faith to get himself noticed. Initially making his name as Cactus Jack, the placeholder gimmick until Dude Love was ready, Cactus's rough around the edges persona and his daredevil antics had American promoters seeing him as little more than a wild but solid mid-card heel in the vein of, say, Kevin Sullivan. After the regime change in WCW that saw Hulk Hogan and his cronies wipe the slate clean, Mick did a lot of his most compelling work in ECW, while Jim Ross implored Vince McMahon to give Foley a shot. That opportunity arrived in the form of the Mankind gimmick in 1996. He burst on the scene in impressive fashion and gave The Undertaker some of his best matches at the time, but he was seen as a largely one-note character before a series of interviews with Jim Ross in '97 changed the fans' and Vince's perception of him forever. Eventually, the real Mick Foley was allowed to shine through Mankind's frightening exterior, and the groundswell of support was too much to ignore. By late '98, he was practically neck and neck with Stone Cold Steve Austin as the top babyface of the WWF, and on the January 4th, '99 episode of Raw, Mrs. Foley's baby boy finally won the big one, at or near the top of a lot of fans' biggest feel-good moments in wrestling. As cliche as it might sound, Foley's is a true Cinderella story in pro wrestling. He was the ultimate journeyman, breaking his body all around the world, finally getting his due. When I was a kid, I was massively inspired watching this stuff. I saw him win the belt and I thought to myself, if he could win the world championship, maybe if I got into it and worked hard, I could become world champion. But no. For shattering every mold possible while still being his full authentic self and reaching world championship glory, Mick Foley is my pick for the least likely world champion of all time. So who are your least likely world champs? Who did I miss? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.